Hi everyone, my name is Abdul, and today I am accompanied with Dylan Hoffman. He is PhD in depth psychology with a concentration in Jungian and archetypal studies from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Thank you, Dylan, for joining me today on the podcast.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you. So today our topic is very much interesting that we see like the defense mechanisms applying in everyday life since our childhood, but we have always studied them through the Freudian lens, but today let's see how they work through Jungian psychology. So Dylan, how would you just start explaining our audience with that?
I would say from a Jungian perspective, and this is sort of a parallel, there's a deep level of developmental psychology that goes into the defense mechanisms. And what I mean by that is that Jung understands the psyche as this totality that's made up of essential discrete parts, from intellect to eros, love, different fundamental. As an infant develops and is interacting with their environment, they tend to take on an egoic identity that is comprised of things that are acceptable to that immediate environment. What is loved, what is praised, what is conducive to survival within the very specific context of caregivers or whatever the context is. In Jung's view, the ego is always a very limited thing. It always requires focusing on one thing and excluding something else from consciousness. And so if a child grows up in let's say a family that emphasizes academics, that child will grow to identify with rationality, with study, with an intellectual orientation, perhaps to the exclusion of emotion or even body awareness. And so in the course of time, those things Jung understands as being essential to the personality, but they've been divided off from the ego identity. And so they will eventually, as the individual matures, want to re-enter the person's sense of self. And so that, from an energetic perspective, what has been excluded in the course of development starts to push itself back in. And because the individual has constructed a self-identity around the exclusion of those things, that's where the defense mechanisms really start to function to keep what was originally split off, to maintain its exclusion.
So can we say that, like, if the defense mechanisms are removed at some stage in life, would they lead us to universal consciousness, like a cosmic state?
And not from a Jungian perspective, it would lead to wholeness. But what for Jung, that means that the ego is never dissolved. It just gains a greater capacity to be in relationship to everything that the person is comprised of, and of the world in general. So it can have this sense of unity with everything, but not a disillusion, a lost. The individual is never lost in Jungian
So not
psychology.
the total annihilation state of the ego.
Correct. Just a greater inclusivity of all of reality into consciousness.
So how much, like, the moral perception that or pseudo-morality, I would say, that we see in our society is much responsible for the defense mechanisms?
A great deal. Because essentially that is for many people, even today, there's sort of a traditional morality that's just sort of imbibed in the home. And so again, that's part of the ego identification, is with a particular moral framework. And that's where the defense mechanisms become particularly strong in Jungian psychology, because for Jung, the next thing sort of bordering the ego is the shadow. And that, in a sense, houses perhaps the most morally ambiguous content, the things that we not that we just didn't identify with, but that we learned to despise.
That makes sense.
And so that first confrontation that Jung would see that the ego has to encounter is essentially a moral challenge, because the ego has to confront what is still a part of the personality, but what the individual always thought was reprehensible.
So we can say that, like, the confrontation of the shadow would lead to that would lead to the it would break the defense mechanisms.
Correct, at that level. But then I think that's where defense mechanisms have a more layered understanding in Jung's view, because the shadow is just one layer that the ego has to come into relationship with. And so at that level is sort of the moral level, what the person finds valueless, finds destructive. And so they have to confront in themselves that they have these things, these propensities within themselves. And that's one level where defense mechanisms, if the person can confront that reality, that defense mechanism is essentially overcome. It's never sort of a completed project in Jung's view, because we can always put them back up, so to speak. But there is a sense that once you've confronted the shadow, the idea that you are a saint, that everyone else has moral problems except you, that is grown through, and you realize, oh, I'm much more morally ambiguous as an individual, and therefore,
like the self-righteous.
Correct, and so that level of projection comes to a halt, the shadow level, where we cease putting all of the evil into the world, and we finally integrate the fact that we also have evil propensities and destructive propensities in ourselves.
Great. So do you think that, like, we need defense mechanisms in our life, or, I mean, without that, the life won't be possible? So what do you think about that?
Yes, from a Jungian perspective, that's 100% true. Jung understood that ego development, this idea that we do need to focus our attention and establish, even if it's limited, even if will have to be deconstructed later on, it's important that we do have a strong, in the healthy sense, ego. Otherwise, we don't have a capacity to integrate anything else. For Jung, the ego is the center of personal consciousness, and if you don't have that, you're essentially in a state of psychosis. And so the ego is required to assimilate anything else. And if you lose the ego, you lose the capacity to do anything else.
I see. That's great. So I think let's move to the first one. It's repression.
Perfect. And this is particularly where the shadow comes in, because repression and of course the defense mechanisms are never conscious. From a Jungian perspective, it's something that the psyche sort of does before something enters awareness, though the ego has the sense of something sort of pushing for awareness. But repression is the exclusion of what we find unacceptable, morally speaking. And so again, the boundary, this is it shouldn't be taken as sort of established what this means, because again, given different environments growing up, some families can find totally opposite things good and bad.
Exactly.
And so like in a therapeutic setting, the therapist would never be able to assume what's in the shadow, what's being repressed, because Jung specifically mentions that in some contexts, the good things about the individual, strengths even, are what are condemned in a family context. And so it can often be, in Jungian circles, it's called the golden shadow, meaning a lot of our best propensities, if our families didn't find them to be good things, we have to go back and get those things out of the shadow. And it's not just the recognition of destructive propensities, but everything that has been excluded, that was denounced sort of in a family context.
So for that, like an adult needs to go back to the childhood. Like, is it a process of self-dialogue?
Yes, it can happen in therapy, but for Jung, individuation, the process of becoming whole is something that happens within and outside of therapy. And so a lot of it does have to do with doing a sort of historical inventory of your family and what you learned to find acceptable about yourself and what you excluded. Probably a sort of cliche example is if there was sort of a family of engineers that found art to be lazy or unproductive or meaningless, and so if a child had artistic propensities but learned that artists are sort of terrible people, then that child would tend to repress that artistic capacity, and later in life it would be a moral struggle, because they would have to come to terms with how that capacity was morally evaluated by their environment. And so it would be a real struggle to get that capacity back into their conscious.
Definitely, that becomes a real struggle. So
Right.
I was reading like yesterday, maybe on Freud's study on hysteria and P.A. Janet as well. So I want to ask, like, the dissociation complex, is that also linked with the process of repression?
Yes, because it's essentially, there's several defense mechanisms that can be lined up here, because it can be dissociation as well, because these are intolerable things for the individual to understand these things belonging to themselves. And because of its moral tint, it's also a kind of splitting. So all of the darkness, all of the evil, I can only identify as the good me versus the bad me. So there can be several layers of what is happening on repression. Repression, splitting, and dissociation, sort of all falling along the same boundary between the ego and the shadow.
I see. I also read that, like, for Jung in dissociation, it was also the archetypal energies that were involved, like unlike Freud and other.
Yes, well, and that's perhaps the major difference here, is that for Jung, what is wanting to enter consciousness is ultimately necessary to the individual, and so and necessary for Jung means archetypal, meaning it has some root in the very nature of human nature that is required for an individual to have a full capacity to be human. And so at that level, it's not at the deepest level of the psyche, everything that needs to become conscious is good might be the wrong word, but is good for the individual. And so it's not just sort of, in the Freudian sense, there's the idea that essentially everything repressed is sort of it can be like aggression or incestuous, and so
like in the personal unconscious, due to the moral reasons or all the things that we introjected during our childhood, maybe.
Right, and they don't necessarily, none of which might be good in the Freudian sense. And so, but in the Jungian sense, we don't just need to sublimate the bad things there. We need them as they are. We need all of those capacities to come online and to become conscious for us to be fully functioning.
But I read very interesting thing in Jungian psychology that like the things like sexual desires or aggression or grief or something like that, if they are repressed for a longer period of time, they can go to the deeper layers in collective unconscious, like the like archetypal grief maybe, or they can go to the deeper layers. So how does that work?
Let's talk about like a child's relationship with a mother. So let's say that the child's relationship with their personal mother, the mother was, let's say, particularly restrictive, didn't allow anger or even affection to show. And so for that child, mother carries the image of their personal mother. But for Jung, the mother is something much bigger than that. And so there's at the personal layer, the individual can only see mother as their individual mother, while the deeper layers of the psyche have a much fuller mothering archetypal dimension. And so at a certain level, that deeper dimension wants to reach the individual, but there's only the mask of the personal mother overlaying it. And so there can be a real buildup of energy because there's a sort of conflict between archetypal mother and personal mother that is going to have to be confronted. And so that does eventually the mask of the personal mother essentially acts as a roadblock to the rest of the archetype. And there's the tension that builds between those two things is what can eventually overwhelm the ego, unless the individual finds some way to differentiate my personal mother from archetypal mothering. And so the complex, Jung would call the personal layer the complex. My relationship with my personal mother gave me a mother complex, which means I've identified mothering with my mother, and that for Jung that's always a dangerous thing to do, even though it's sort of inevitable. But as we develop and we need more of the archetypal mother, that complex gets activated and activated and activated until we become aware of its limitations. It's almost like Jung sometimes uses the analogy of shoes that don't fit, and essentially the pain of repeatedly trying to make our feet fit in shoes that are too small is the psyche's attempt to bring our awareness that no, the pay attention, the shoes are too small. There's something wrong here. There's something that doesn't fit. And that is supposed to sort of spur our consciousness to maybe say, oh, maybe my mother isn't all that mothering is. And just that break of identity between personal mother and archetypal mother gives oxygen for room to breathe in the psyche to come into relationship with something bigger.
Great. I mean, that's a very uh, great perspective for me, and I believe for the listeners as well, because I was really looking into that to differentiate between the archetypal complex and the personal complexes, and because it's get really difficult, and I believe we too much rely on the personal complexes that we don't go beyond that. So it's very
Yes,
important to know that.
absolutely.
So let's move to the next one. It's projection, very important for the shadow.
Absolutely. And well, the interesting thing is that Jung identifies projection with the archetype beyond the shadow, uh, that he calls the anima,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is uh, his idea of the archetypal feminine, um,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
particularly in men, but that can sort of get complicated at a certain level. But so for Jung, the projection function of the psyche resides in the anima. Well, let me back up. The layer beyond the shadow for Jung is anima or
Mm-hmm.
animus,
Yep.
depending on gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so projection it does happen in shadow, where we
Mm-hmm.
project all the things that we find morally reprehensible onto other people. But
Mm-hmm.
it even more so happens when we project what we've identified as otherness in gender onto other people. And so what that means is sort of our immediate falling in love with someone is for Jung a projection of the
Of an anima.
anima
Mm-hmm.
or animus, depending on our ego identity, how we've identified gender wise, and what
Mm-hmm.
we've identify as other. So this is where the drama of romance is particularly a place where Jung locates projection.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So, like the
Go ahead.
most of the emotions that are exposed out of the psyche or the unconscious, that would be not from the shadow, but that would be like the projection of the anima.
Correct.
Like in man, any kind of emotions, you can say anger or sadness or whatsoever.
Right.
So that would be like, because I usually understood that that's from the shadow. So that would be from beyond shadow from anima, right?
Correct. Or animus again. It's
Depending on
if
the
we
gender, right?
yeah, if we put this in a developmental context again, let's say me personally, I grow up in a context where I identify as male and masculine,
Mm-hmm.
and what that tends to imply developmentally is I exclude what I identify as feminine
Mm-hmm.
as something other than myself. And so for
Mm-hmm.
Jung, that otherness again still belongs to every individual. It's just not accepted as such. And so
Mm-hmm.
at that layer of the feminine in the male being excluded from consciousness, in the psyche's way of bringing that excluded feminine back in is to project it onto uh, a woman, so to speak, that then takes on the qualities of what we've rejected about ourselves. And then
Mm-hmm.
we come into relationship with that feminine in the figure of someone else. And that's really the projective relationship that happens at the anima and animus level. Same
That
thing
makes sense. Mm-hmm.
with a woman who has identified as female and feminine, has excluded what are traditionally conceived as masculine traits, even though they truly belong to her psyche. The only way the psyche brings her into relationship with what she's excluded is to project those masculine qualities onto a man who then that woman is attracted to in order to be in relationship with what she unconsciously really is, but needs an exterior figure to see those qualities that she's missing.
Uh-huh, I see. So that it's like what we see as shadow projection, that's mostly from anima or animus. All the emotions and all those emotions exposing out of the psyche, they are mostly from anima or animus, like the shadow projection.
Particularly, the way to differentiate, it's not that there isn't shadow projections, but the way to differentiate what archetypal figure might be behind a projection is that with shadow projections, the quality of the relationship that established is antipathy, hate. Whereas with anima and animus projections, the quality of the relationship established with the projection is attraction and love. And so if someone is projecting something that they despise, you're dealing with probably a shadow layer projection. But if they're projecting something and they just can't get enough of that person, they want to be around them, it can be even a celebrity or something, and they watch all their shows or read all their books, that attractive quality tells you you're outside of the shadow level of projection. You're in an attractive
animus.
Yeah, correct.
Great. That's great. So I believe let's move to the next one. It's displacement.
This one probably puts us back into shadow territory, or even further ahead into self, the archetype of the self. Or well, there's several layers, but there's a part for Jung where the religious aspect of the psyche becomes a central developmental task. And for Jung, the religious element is he describes it as numinous, which means very potent, very difficult to handle in terms of its emotional load. And so this can be a very different from the Freudian perspective, where displacement can be, I can't handle sort of my religious drive to seek a deeper meaning, or to even worship and be devoted to something. And so I bring it down a notch and put it into a social cause, or even a cult figure, or something that feels more maybe even rational or manageable, but takes something really religious and devotional and puts it into a cause that then the individual has a real deep devotion to, that other people don't really understand. This is where Jung really locates political movements like communism and totalitarianism. Is the individual has a religious drive but doesn't know where to put it, and so they'll locate it in a president or a view of social progress, and then they relate to that cause as if it's their religion.
So that's very much different from the Freudian displacement, I believe.
Yes, very different.
Great. So let's move to the next one. It's reaction formation.
This tends to be probably shadow material, because it's normally repressed, morally rejected material, and so the individual, because they find it too difficult to accept themselves as morally ambiguous, will then 10 times over identify with being righteous and good, to balance the pressure they feel to acknowledge their darkness and shadow. That's particularly where this comes into
So, like, as in Freudian, like psychology, we say that in the reaction formation, it's mostly when uh, you you're actually angry on someone, but you totally show the different kind of emotion. So, would
Right.
it be different in Jungian psychology, or is it the same? Like you don't
Okay.
accept the shadow, but you are responding in a totally different way.
Right. Well, it's essentially the same where you're not accepting the shadow, and the way you do that is by
Hmm.
over identifying even more so with the good, with being
More
saintly.
like a persona. I can, or we can
Correct.
say that it's mostly related with the persona, like adaptation with the righteous persona.
Correct. Correct.
Hmm. That makes it clear. So
And
sublimation. Sorry.
oh,
Yep.
it can come out particularly again in religious situations where
Hmm.
individuals who are really starting to feel confronted by the shadow throw themselves even more so into some sort of religious practice or devotional
Hmm.
practice where they identify with particular saints and that kind of thing, where it's
Uh-huh.
like I'm
So
gonna
just like to avoid the inferior qualities within them.
right.
Uh-huh. But how much like is that destructive or beneficial for the psyche when you, I would call it spiritual bypassing, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah,
Would
that's
Mhm,
essentially where this is. Yeah, and
mhm,
in Jungian psychology, it's a terrible thing.
yeah,
It's
that's very much we see that nowadays, like the positive psychology or like motivational psychology, and that's very much people move towards.
yes, and this is where Jung was really caution Westerners against uh, sort of uh, appropriating yogic and Eastern practices,
Hmm. Hmm.
because he felt that that tended to give Westerners an excuse to not get into their shadow because
Uh-huh.
they could ascend to consciousness with the all, or this yogic discipline could help them become stronger at defending against the shadow, and then instead of letting the shadow in. And
Hmm.
so this is Jung was very reticent about what has become such a prominent thing in the West of people running to yoga classes
Hmm.
and meditation classes, but not necessarily doing it in a way that makes them more aware of who they actually are, but gives them a way to escape. Uh,
Uh-huh. That's kind of a in itself. So we can say that like the spiritual bypassing in itself is a kind of a defense mechanism from shadow.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Hmm. That makes sense. So the next one is sublimation.
I This is probably, well, the only archetype that this would really apply to would be the shadow, because
Hmm.
like I said, with other archetypes, there doesn't need to be a a sort of non-negative expression of like anima and animus, because
Hmm.
for Jung, in themselves, anima and animus are positive strengths
Hmm.
that you don't need to express them non-destructively. At their core, they're essentially non-destructive.
Hmm.
They're only destructive if they're repressed, but in themselves they're good. So sublimation would really only apply to what are actual destructive propensities in the shadow,
Hmm.
and instead of falling into another state of repression, Jung would say, no, you have to stay conscious of your capacity to be destructive, and
Hmm.
in being conscious of it, you can not act it out directly. You can do something different with the anger or the rage or
Hmm.
whatever the emotion is behind
So
it. And
what Jung
so
had to say with like the sublimation of instinctual like impulsivity or urges.
again, for Jung, they're not bad.
Hmm.
So So the instinctual layer of the psyche is something that Jung would encourage people to express directly, because again, for him, the destructivity comes in the repression of that instinctuality.
Yep.
And so, like, in a certain level, for Jung, all archetypes are also instincts. And so they, even at their instinctual level, what is trying to be expressed isn't something destructive. So even at that level, it's not sublimation as Freud would understand it. It would be just becoming conscious of that instinct in itself and letting it be present in your life like it wants to be.
Or letting it flow through you.
Correct.
Or experiencing it, yep.
It doesn't necessarily need to be something different. It just needs to be consciously expressed.
That makes sense. So the last one is rationalization.
In a lot of ways, rationalization is for Jung what the ego is. It is our capacity to interpret and make sense of, and so in a lot of ways for Jung, what is excluded from the ego is emotionality. And so in development, this rationalization it might even be the deepest layer of defense that the ego has, because it's essentially what the ego is. And so the ego has to come to terms with what is irrational, what's emotional, what can't be controlled. And that in itself puts rationalization into relationship with other things. So you don't necessarily get rid of the ego, but you become aware that the rationalization is one approach among many. And so it becomes relativized in relationship to other ways of knowing, other ways of experiencing beyond rational. But in terms of defense mechanisms, rationalization is what the ego does to exclude the shadow, to exclude anima and animus, because they are all bigger than the ego. And so the only control the ego has in relationship to them is to define them away as
because it seems like rationalization is more it's more carried away by anima possession and animus possession, because that's where much of rationalization would occur. Don't you think so? Or it would be something different?
No, yeah, that's correct. Well, this is also where sort of a cultural layer of the psyche comes in, because the animus is rationality in Jung's view. And in some ways, the broadest context of how he understands development is that every ego starts out in relationship with mother. And so to differentiate is to differentiate from all things feminine, irrational, emotional, and this happens in men and women. So we tend to, as we differentiate from mother, to over-identify with the rational. And so again, that as we move back into relationship with all of the psyche, that one function of rationality is shown as just being one function of the psyche that got overemphasized in our disidentifying with the mother and everything we label as other. So that's also anima in particular, because at a certain layer, the anima is the broadest of the emotional and feminine categories of the psyche for Jung. And so even men, even people who identify as feminine and female and women, still in their development, they differentiate from mother, and so can tend to over-identify with rationalization and the father and the animus. And so
that makes sense. Yep.
Yeah.
So, like, I have a last question. Like, how would you differentiate between a healthy ego or a weak ego, and how one can avoid defense mechanisms and face the shadow?
A weak ego in a Jungian perspective is one that either dissolves, and so it has a tendency towards psychosis. So that's a very, very dangerous level of weak ego in Jung's perspective, is that it just cannot keep any boundaries up to anything, and is just overwhelmed and gets lost in every emotion or every archetypal encounter. And so the person cannot maintain their own sense of self in relationship to other things. So that's one way of describing a weak ego in Jung's perspective. The other side of the spectrum of the weak ego is the ego that cannot let anything else in besides its own rationality. And so it just continues to, it's comprised of defense mechanisms, and they're so strong that nothing else can get in. That is also a weak ego, ironically enough. A healthy ego for Jung is one that can simultaneously maintain its own sense of circumscribed reality, but doesn't take that for the whole of reality. And so it can maintain itself while also being in relationship to other things. That is sort of a porous ego that allows other things in, like a good digestive system that excludes things that will tear it apart, but isn't so closed that it excludes everything. And I think for Jung, the way to develop a healthy ego that can both maintain itself and be in relationship with things beyond itself is literally sort of diversity of experience in life. Meaning knowing people that are different from you, that value different things from you, and knowing how to not get lost in their perspective, again, which would be a weak ego, but to not deny the validity of other perspectives and things outright, but to be in a state of listening, a state of I know what I think I know, but I'm a limited person, and so I'm available to learn that what I know isn't everything that's possible to know.
So that would be a sign of a healthy ego.
That would be a sign of a healthy ego. Because in some ways that's required for the entirety of development in Jung's perspective, is
exactly
the ego coming into relationship with multiple layers of otherness. And so the healthy ego is just sort of a stance toward otherness that is open without being lost in it.
That makes sense. So like how one can face the shadow and remove the defense mechanism. So it would be like with the integration of the healthy ego, right?
Right. The only way development happens for Jung, again, is that the ego comes to accept that what it didn't used to understand about itself, it now does. So it's this capacity to shift the threshold of self-identity to expand it further. Because at first it's a narrow thing that has excluded almost everything, and then in confronting the shadow, the ego realizes, oh, I'm more than just good things. I also can tend to lose my cool or get angry or destructive. And so the identity expands to include that realization. And then the next layer is, I've excluded, if I'm a male, I've excluded everything feminine from my identity, but I'm also emotional. I also long for connection. And so my identity expands again to include another layer of otherness. And
just
so,
like widening the sphere of consciousness.
Absolutely.
That's great. I think it was a great experience learning on defense mechanism according to Jungian psychology, because I have always studied through the Freudian lens, but it's great to actually differentiate between the personal complexes and archetypal complexes, because that's what take us into the deeper realms. And it was a great experience learning from you. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Dylan, for joining me today on the podcast.
I really appreciate it. Thank you again for inviting me on.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.